Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. 50 years ago this week, Israelis were riding high. In just 6 days, the Jewish state's army had won a stunning victory over the combined militaries of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Israel more than tripled in size, winning control of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. East Jerusalem and the holy sites of the Western Wall and Temple Mount came under Jewish control for the first time in 2,000 years. Now, the victory not only ensured the survival of the State of Israel, but cemented its place as the strongest military force in the whole region. In June of '67, it looked like Israel was well positioned to trade conquered land for an enduring peace with its Arab neighbors. But a half-century later, the legacy of that war looks decidedly different. This month's celebrations in Israel were muted, not least because its military continues to occupy the West Bank and guard over 3 million stateless and largely impoverished Palestinians. Now, to talk more about that and the remarkable effects of this week-long war, we'll hear from a panel of experts in just a few minutes. But first, we're joined by Avraham Sela. He's a former Israeli paratrooper who fought in one of the bloodiest battles of the Six-Day War. He later became a professor of international relations at Hebrew University and has written extensively on the modern Middle East. He joins us by Skype from Jerusalem. Avraham, welcome.
Hello. Good evening.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. You were in the Israeli army as it prepared for this war 50 years ago. Egypt had closed access to the Gulf of Aqaba, and the Arab armies were massing on your borders. What was the feeling then? What was the mood like when Israel began this attack?
Well, it was, first of all, a lot of uncertainty and a lot of anxiety. When we were mobilized, it was hours after Nasser closed the Tiran Straits, a motion that was well known at that time to be considered by Israel as a casus belli. So we were actually the last formation to be mobilized after almost 10 days of increasing Israeli deployment of forces, especially on the Egyptian border. So when we went to service, it meant that Israel was fully mobilized militarily.
And what? Well, go ahead. Well, what happened to you during this war?
Well, first of all, for almost 2 weeks, we were not sure whether we will at all come to the point of fighting. We were hiding anywhere where we could hide under trees or in cultivated areas with trees, with orchards. And our plans, the plan of my brigade was to invade northern Sinai from the sea, while others from the same brigade had to parachute on that area and meet with ground forces coming from the Israeli-Egyptian border. But within the first hour or so of the battle, on the 5th of June, it turned that our job became redundant because the progress of the land forces were so rapid that we were left without a job. So for a few hours, we were quite frustrated, as it happens to people who were preparing for many, many years to engage in battle. And then in the evening, when the situation in Jerusalem became really critical, we were called to go to Jerusalem, to go up into Jerusalem on a very, very rocky road. And when we arrived, we had little idea about what we were supposed to do and where we were going. And more than anything else, we had no clue about the terrain. We had no maps. We had no information. The little intelligence was given in a brief meeting with the battalion commander to which I was attached, and we started moving. And believe it or not, we eventually arrived at the ammunition hill, and we started. I belonged to a company which specialized in engineering, namely using explosives and mines and so on and so forth. And we had to open a path for two tanks. Actually, they started as three. One of them was hit by a Jordanian shell. And when we started to get really close to the hill where Jordanians were, deeply entrenched and very forcefully fighting, the tanks moved, and I was moving behind, and all of a sudden I was hit by a bullet, and the war ended, as far as I was concerned, about less than 3 years since we started to engage in that battle, and I spent most of the time.
Sorry, less than 3 days after that battle, the war ended.
Right, but from that moment on, I was in hospital, and for me, the war was over. I could only listen to, radio and stories in between.
Well, tell us if you would, what were your feelings then? You were wounded, you were in the hospital. There must have been this great feeling of euphoria that the war was over, that this might be the end of wars for Israel.
No, Jason, not at all. From the very, very first moment, I was, half conscious, and I heard all kinds of rumors about the number of people who were brought to the hospital as corpse. I spent almost 36 hours before taking me to the operation room, because there were others with much more serious situation, and I was with a torn apart lung, but they managed to stabilize my situation, so I was not very, very urgent case. But all along, during those 3-4 days, I remember the feeling that, oh God, there were so many people killed, wounded, and many people were on my right and left side, and these wounded and rumors about the number of people killed kept coming again and again. So I don't remember any kind of euphoria. And let me tell you a personal story, okay? When the war came to an end, my little brother, who at that time was only 17, and he was in a paramilitary school, which produced many of the Israeli leading military figures. And when he entered the room, the first thing he said was, what am I going to do? Wars are over. This is it. I have nothing to look forward to. In other words, he was very frustrated. And what I remember is saying to him, let's hope that this would be the case, but I don't think so.
Well, Avraham Sela, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A reminder that you're listening to Global Journalist. If you're just joining us, we're talking today about the 6-day war between Israel and its Arab neighbors that happened 50 years ago this month. This briefest of wars has had far-reaching and unexpected consequences both for the victor, Israel, as well as for its opponents, the Arab nations. The fallout from this conflict still shapes the world we live in today and probably affects Americans and others in the West in ways they don't even think about. Now, to broaden our discussion, we're going to bring in 3 other people who've tracked this issue closely. Joining us from Charlottesville, Virginia is Bill Quandt. He's a former National Security Council staffer who worked on the Arab-Israeli peace process in the 1970s and later became a professor of political science at the University of Virginia. In London is Anton LaGuardia. He's the deputy foreign editor of The Economist magazine and a former Middle East correspondent. And in New York is Jane Eisner. She's the editor-in-chief of The Forward, a Jewish news outlet that publishes in English and Yiddish that was founded in 1897. Welcome to all of you. Bill Quandt, we just heard Avraham Sela talking about this discussion that he had in the hospital with his younger brother who was in a paramilitary organization, who was saying, geez, after this war in 1967, I'm not going to get to fight. Obviously, that hasn't happened. So why was there this perception in Israel that this might be the end of wars?
Well, at the end of the 6-day war, the magnitude of the Israeli victory seemed to be so great that it was almost unimaginable that the Arab parties, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, could get their act together and launch another war anytime in the foreseeable future. There was a sense, certainly among strategists, that this was a major setback for Egypt, for the Soviet Union, which had backed Egypt, for Nasser personally, for the concept of Arab nationalism. Jordan had lost control of the West Bank, and the Syrian forces were badly damaged. So it was actually hard to imagine that within a matter of years, the war would resume, first as a so-called war of attrition, and then more dramatically in 1973 as a full-fledged Egyptian-Syrian surprise attack on October 6, 1973.
And of course, we've had a number of smaller conflicts between Hamas, between Hezbollah. There's been 2 intifadas. But Jane Eisler, if I could turn this to you, tell us how you perceived this war back in 1967 as an American Jew. How did Jews in the U.S. feel at that time?
Well, I was a little girl in New York, and honestly, we were terrified. I'm sure that I was picking up signals from my parents and the adults in my life, as children do, but it just did seem that little Israel was surrounded by enemies and could not possibly get through this existential challenge to its very existence. So it was frightening, and those first few days were just terrifying. And then as the victories mounted, and of course the elation that we all felt at the end of less than a week, when Israel felt like David to the Goliath of the Arab nations. You know, it's only later as an adult that my views on this have become more complicated and nuanced. But I do think that it's fair to say that for American Jews, it was a moment of deep pride. It's been a long time since we had a military victory, and a sense that it affirmed Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state in the Middle East.
Well, Anton LaGuardia, you've written that the occupation that this war begat has left Palestinians with sort of half-lives. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, one of the striking things about what happened is, as you heard from Avraham Sela, the degree to which the victory was unexpected, improvised, and that the occupation, that the sort of bounty of territory that Israel captured was sort of almost sort of unexpected and accidental. Gershom Gorenberg talks about the accidental empire, and he doesn't quite, you know, and he explains that this sort of question of what to do with the territory remains unresolved to this day. And for Palestinians, so what you have is a situation in which, it's not fully annexed, but there's no Palestinian state, there's no peace, there's no war, at least as far as the Palestinians are concerned. And therefore, there is this kind of perpetual limbo that has gone on for 50 years, punctuated by extremely bloody moments and by a prolonged period of negotiations that appear to go nowhere. So I think that, the sort of the half-life idea tries to capture this idea of being sort of in a sort of unspecific gray zone, in a limbo, where the situation is, plainly not as awful as it is in the rest of the Arab world at the moment, but is, far from ideal or settled. And, crucially, Palestinians don't have a homeland that they feel is entirely theirs, that they run as entirely theirs.
Well, you raise an interesting point, and let me turn that to Bill Quandt. Bill, you had raised the 1973 war between Israel and the Arabs, and you, while you were at the National Security Council, you were involved in some of the negotiations around the Camp David Accords in the late 1970s, which brought peace between Egypt and Israel. And yet there still has been, decades of conflict since then over other territories. Why was it that a deal could be made between Egypt and Israel, and yet so much is still unresolved?
Well, first, Egypt was the strongest Arab country. And so for Israel, there was a very strong incentive to see if they could make what was in practice a so-called separate peace with Egypt without necessarily having it be linked to the Palestinian issue or the other Arab fronts. And if they could, they would succeed in neutralizing the only major military threat they faced. So they were willing to give up more in exchange for peace with Egypt than they were prepared to give up, for example, peace with Jordan or peace with Syria. And after the 1973 war, Sadat made a rather dramatic turn away from depending on the Soviet Union to cooperating with the United States and making it clear that he would be ready on certain terms for peace with Israel. And so that became the main theme of the next several years, 1974, 75, 76, 77, 78, and then finally the peace treaty in 1979. And I think one of the important outcomes of the 1967 war was that it opened the way, not immediately, but it opened the way eventually for a peace between Egypt and Israel. The tragedy of that war is that it wasn't able to open the way for a broader peace with Israel's other Arab neighbors and with the Palestinians.
Well, Jane Eisner, now as people have been marking this anniversary this month, at least on the left in Israel and in the United States, there's been this sort of sentiment that this great military victory led to sort of a moral corruption and decline in Israel sort of as a nation. Do you think that overstates things? I mean, Israel still does face sort of significant threats from Hezbollah, from Hamas. What's your take?
I think that does overstate things, but the occupation remains a great moral challenge to Israelis and, in fact, to Jews everywhere. It's not right that Israel rules over another people. Now, it's not entirely Israel's fault that this situation has lasted for 50 years. The Palestinians had many, many chances to change the nature of their existence and to certainly refrain from the kind of violence that they resorted to that harmed and killed so many people. But in the end, you can't just blame the occupied entirely for an occupation. And I do think that there is a way in which this has harmed a part of Israeli society, and by extension, the values with which American Jews and other Jews hold, that we believe in the individual rights for people to have sovereignty over their lives. That's why Israel should exist, for Jews to be able to have sovereignty. And I feel the same way that Palestinians should as well.
Well, Anton LaGuardia, many people today understand this conflict as a religious conflict. You've written that the religious dimension to this really didn't come to the fore until this war in 1967. Tell us about that.
Well, for the longest time in the wars that William Quandt talks about, it was a war between states in which Palestinians were bystanders or audiences, in the contest that would determine the land that they felt was theirs. From 67 onwards, the Palestinians more or less give up on the states coming to liberate them and decide to take up arms themselves for right or for wrong. So you have the birth of Palestinian militancy, you've got the militant factions that take over the PLO in 68, you've got the resort to terrorism with the seizing of jetliners. Remember the days when you could just get onto a plane without security? Which then continued into the first and the second, the war in Lebanon, the first intifada, the second intifada, and so on. So, in a sense, the Palestinians assert themselves violently. The Israelis realize after the first intifada that there is no cost-free occupation. That's when intifada was, merely stones. But by the time it enters the second intifada, which is guns and bullets, they also feel they can't afford to let go because it's too dangerous. Security would be endangered. The intifada has, extracted such a price of blood that it's impossible to let go. So that's part of the reason why the two sides are stuck.
We'll take a moment to remind you that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking today about the legacy of the Six-Day War, the conflict between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria that ended 50 years ago this month. We're joined by Bill Quandt, an emeritus professor of political science at the University of Virginia, by Anton LaGuardia of The Economist magazine, and Jane Eisner of the Jewish news outlet The Forward. If you're interested in more Global Journalist, you can visit our website, globaljournalist.org. There you can access our archives and find our ongoing reports on undercovered international news and human rights issues. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or subscribe to the program on YouTube or iTunes. And Bill Quandt, if I could turn this to you then, much of what is at issue now between the two sides is the issue of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, this territory that Israel did win from Jordan in the 1967 war, and has since been populated by some, I think it's 400,000 Jewish settlers. Now, was that sort of the original idea or intent of the war, that Israel would win territory and be able to colonize it with Jewish settlers, or was that something that came about sort of haphazardly?
Well, I don't think it was haphazard, but there was no grand plan in June of 1967 what to do about specifically the West Bank and Gaza. There were different camps arguing over what to do, but gradually there were East Jerusalem's fate was at least decided by the Israelis, as far as they could decide it unilaterally, by early annexation and the building of settlements in what had formerly been Jordanian Jerusalem. So that happened quite quickly. And then within a few years, when I first went into government, it was 1972, there were already about 20,000 settlers living in settlements outside of the greater Jerusalem area. And we thought that was a problem when it was only 20,000, that this would make it harder and harder for successive Israeli governments to ever cede land back to either Jordan or eventually to the Palestinians, or on the Golan front to Syria, where settlements are also being built. And it did prove to be an issue in every negotiation. With the Syrians, it was an issue. With the Egyptians, it was an issue. And of course, it has been a very big issue every time Palestinians and Israelis have sat down to negotiate, which they have done. I mean, they do talk, but they keep running up against real issues: fate of Jerusalem, the rights of refugees to compensation or return, and the territory. And the territory is difficult to manage because today, instead of a few thousand people beyond the so-called Green Line, there are now over 400,000. And it really is difficult to imagine any Israeli government, even a peace-oriented one, going to those 400,000 people and saying, you know, the time has come for us to make a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and the price is that you guys will either have to leave or some of you may stay, but under Palestinian rule. That's going to be hard for any Israeli government, but it's a consequence of decisions that have been made deliberately by successive Israeli governments.
Well, let me move this to Jane Eisner, because President Trump has appointed his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and a former Trump Organization lawyer named Jason Greenblatt to work on a potential peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. How optimistic are you that they might succeed where other administrations have failed?
I'm going to be diplomatic here and say that I always would like to be optimistic that there can be a peaceful solution that gives Palestinian sovereignty and Israelis security and safe borders. Since Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt have absolutely no experience, that may turn out to be a good thing. But I am very skeptical that people without experience, even if their intentions are good, can go where those with a great deal more knowledge, understanding, and empathy for the different cultures and the different issues have not been able to do it. If they can, all the better, but I remain very skeptical.
Well, Anton LaGuardia, I wanted to touch on this whole idea of the two-state solution, because that has been sort of what successive administrations in Washington, other Western powers, Israel itself, various Arab nations have said needs to happen, is there needs to be two states, a Palestinian state alongside Israel, sort of based in the West Bank, but with parts of East Jerusalem in it. Is that fundamentally sort of a dead concept 50 years on, with 800,000 Jewish settlers living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank?
So the idea goes back to the 47 UN partition plan and even the 37 Peel Commission plan. So it's been around for a long time. Why? Because there are two people who don't want to live in the same country, and therefore people tend to come back to this idea of partitioning the land and creating two states. The problem with that is that it creates two very small states in which both people feel the land is too small. They feel they give up something precious For the Israelis, they give up the lands of the Bible. For the Palestinians, they give up the great cities from which they fled in 48. And so, and the two sides don't trust each other at all. So, in theory, the two-state solution would be wonderful, but in practice, it doesn't happen. And as the settlement process goes on, it tends to drift towards what is, in effect, a one-state solution. Now, there's a problem with that because it's very hard in a land that now encompasses roughly equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River to have a single state that is Jewish majority, that is democratic, and is not discriminatory. So, the Israelis sort of don't know how to resolve this conundrum, and they wait. And the way they sort of hold on is to say it's the other side's fault that we can't have peace, and therefore we will keep this temporary occupation going for a bit longer until the Palestinians are ready to make peace on terms that we can accept. So the danger is that, in the inability to get to a two-state solution, you end up towards a one-state that is, unfair, unbalanced, discriminatory, and in the words of Ehud Barak, sliding towards apartheid, although that is obviously a strong word that a lot of Israelis would object to. But it's interesting that people on the mainstream center-left in Israel are using such terms.
Well, Bill Quandt, our time does grow short here, but you heard Anton sort of give an overview of some of the dangers of maintaining the status quo. It does seem like there is this sort of state of no peace, no war, which has been going on for some time now. Who does that status quo favor? I mean, it seems like Israel is stronger militarily, economically. It has a friendly president in the White House. So does it make sense for Israel just to sort of hang on the way things are?
Oh, I think one of the reasons it does just continue is that the stronger party, Israel, doesn't feel that the alternatives are very convincing from their point of view, that they will be better off if they cede the territory or if they sort of renegotiate a different contract with their Palestinian neighbors. So the cost of making peace seems high and the benefits seem low, whereas the cost of making peace with Egypt were reasonably high, but the benefits were very obvious, and most Israelis went along with it. So I'm afraid that since the stronger of the parties is pretty content with the status quo as compared to any realistic alternative, this is just going to go on, and we may all deplore it, and we may start seeing more and more people use terms like apartheid, but I don't see that anybody has a realistic peace plan now. Certainly not Jared Kushner and Jacob Greenblatt. And in any case, this is not an American problem to solve. It's an Israeli-Palestinian problem, and the international community can help, but we don't have the magic wand.
We're going to have to leave it there for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Avraham Sela, Bill Quandt, Anton LaGuardia, and Jane Eisner for joining us. Our producer this week is Rachel Foster Gimbel, with assistance from Idam Kasaye. Pat Akers is our audio engineer, and Travis McMillan is our director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.